This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Sue Herrera.
Spending showdown. The White House may have thrown a wild card into the negotiations as the deadline to keep the government up and running fast approaches.
France's Rust Belt, why global investors will be focused on this European nation this weekend.
A family dilemma. If the only insurance carrier in eastern Tennessee pulls out of Obamacare, what happens to those who rely on it? Those stories and more tonight on the Nightly Business Report for this Friday, April the 21st. And we bid you good evening, everybody. I'm Bill Griffith, in tonight for Tyler Matheson.
And I'm Sue Herrera, and we are coming to you tonight from the New York Stock Exchange, where the market's focus is squarely on Washington. We are now 1 week away from the government potentially shutting down. And even though Congress is in recess, leaders in both the House and the Senate are working to reach an agreement that will keep the government funded past the April 28th deadline. But those negotiations may have been thrown a curveball. The White House budget director said one of the priorities of the Trump administration is money for a border wall.
When you talk about funding the government, there's an opportunity for us to work together. And what we're focusing on right now is we have our list of priorities. It won't surprise anybody what some of them are. We want more money for defense. We want to build a border wall. We want more money for immigration enforcement.
So the sticking points in the budget negotiations are border wall, of course, immigration enforcement, and as we've been reporting, insurance subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. Ilan Mui is covering the story for us from Washington. Ilan, walk us through some of those GOP demands.
Right. Well, the hard line from the administration has really caught lawmakers in both parties off guard here. Again, you mentioned that money for the border wall, stepped up immigration enforcement. Those are two things that Democrats have pointed to as poison pills in any spending bill. Now, just a few days ago, congressional aides have been signaling that negotiations were going very well, that they expected to reach some sort of a deal. But this really raises questions about how hard a line the administration is going to draw.
We know what the Democrats don't want, Ilan, those two poison pills. What do they want in these negotiations?
Well, that last item you mentioned, insurance subsidies, that is one area that the White House has signaled that they might be willing to compromise, and that's on payments to insurance companies that cover low-income households that are called for under the Affordable Care Act. But the problem with that is that Democrats say that shouldn't be a bargaining chip, that those payments are due to insurers anyway, and that's something that they were already due. So Democrats are saying that any trade of insurance payments for border wall funding is really a non-starter.
But what are the options if the deadline isn't met?
Well, the president said today that so far negotiations are going well, so that is his interpretation of where things stand. And there is an informal consensus among lawmakers right now in Washington that they will need more than 1 week in order to reach an agreement. They might push back that deadline by another week to continue the negotiations. And that would actually be a good sign that they are in talks, that they are in discussions. But if they cannot reach that agreement, guys, we could be faced with a government shutdown on our hands.
All right. Ilan Mui, thank you so much.
Meantime, President Trump did reiterate Treasury Secretary Mnuchin's comments of yesterday, namely that a tax plan is near. But today he put a date on it, namely Wednesday of next week. During an interview with the Associated Press, the president said that the tax cut would be, in his words, massive. Stocks pared some of their losses on those comments, but still ended lower for the day. The Dow fell just about 31 points, closing at 20,547. The Nasdaq dropped by 6 off those all-time highs, and the S&P 500 gave back 7. But for the week, the major averages and indexes were all higher. The Nasdaq up nearly 2%. And it was a rough week for oil. That lost nearly 7%, settling today below $50 a barrel for the first time this month.
The president is also directing the Treasury Department to begin new reviews of banking rules. The first review looks at the process of winding down large, failing financial companies. That provision within the group of Wall Street regulations was designed to protect taxpayers from large bailouts like the ones following the financial crisis. The second will look at part of the Dodd-Frank law that identifies firms large enough to merit more regulation.
And before he signed those reviews, the vice chair of the Federal Reserve warned that any significant rollback of financial regulations could have consequences.
There are aspects of Dodd-Frank which, if they were taken away, would have very serious potential consequences for the economy. Not immediately, but when times get tough.
Vice Chair Fisher also pushed back against the idea that banking regulations put in place following the financial crisis have gone too far.
The Treasury Department will not give permission to ExxonMobil to work in Russia and drill in areas prohibited by U.S. sanctions. As we reported earlier this week, Exxon reportedly asked if it could work on an oil project with Russia's state oil company Rosneft. Secretary Steven Mnuchin said the decision was made in consultation with the president.
On Wall Street, large industrial companies were in focus. Both General Electric and Honeywell reported better than expected earnings and revenue for the quarter. And that's important to investors because these are companies that operate across the globe. Bob Pisani has more from the New York Stock Exchange.
3 industrials and 3 good earnings reports today. After a big week for banks, industrials are beginning to report first quarter earnings, and the results generally pretty positive. General Electric, Honeywell, and toolmaker Stanley Works Black & Decker all reported earnings above expectations today. More important was the guidance for the full year. General Electric affirmed its full year guidance. Honeywell and Stanley Works both raised guidance modestly. That's part of a trend. Yesterday, Dover and paint maker Sherwin-Williams both beat expectations, and they also raised their full year guidance. So it's a little bit early in the earnings season, but it's a good start overall. These big industrial companies are important because they sell a lot of products all over the world. So they're a good gauge of not just the U.S. economy, but even the global economy. Honeywell, for example, gets more than 40% of its revenues outside the United States. They make thermostats and parts for air conditioners and heaters and fans and safes and home generators, paper shredders, all sorts of things all over the world of an industrial nature. The bottom line, banks and industrials are off to a good start, but it's still not clear if these somewhat higher earnings are enough to really move the stock market forward, given that stocks are expensive right now. There's also significant geopolitical risks out there, and it's also not clear when President Trump can get his tax cut plan together and also get it through Congress. A lot of unknowns right now. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Bob Pisani at the New York Stock Exchange.
There's a curious trend emerging in the market. Though stocks are generally higher over the past few months, not all are participating in the move to the upside. Dominic Chu takes a look.
Stocks are near record highs again, but for many market observers, the story isn't nearly as bullish as those headlines would suggest. That's because they're not seeing as many companies participating fully in the stock market rally. Most of the heavy lifting in the market has come from mega cap technology-related names.
I think one of the things that's leading people to invest in sort of these mega cap market-leading areas of the market and stocks is that, there is a lot of concern from a policy perspective. The reality is that they want to make sure they're hedging a little bit and buying those companies that, will be growth drivers, probably absent even, major changes in tax reform.
The S&P 500's 5 most valuable stocks make up around 12% of the total index, and each of those 5 stocks is having a winning record so far in 2017. You got Apple, Google parent company Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon.com, and Facebook all posting gains. Apple, Amazon, and Facebook each up at least 20% year-to-date versus the 5% gain in the broader S&P 500. Experts start to worry when much of the market's gains are concentrated in just a handful of stocks.
Historically, when you do touch market tops, you normally see the breadth go down and the market's led by a smaller and smaller subset of names.
While there is an abundance of caution at current levels, it doesn't appear as though there's any reason to panic anytime soon.
If you look at general investor behavior, it appears that investors don't necessarily seem to be acting the way they do when the markets are near a top. But nonetheless, stocks are rich across the board regardless.
The debate rages on. Are economic and corporate fundamentals healthy enough to sustain the current upward move in stocks? Or is the market priced for perfection and ready for that long-awaited pullback? For Nightly Business Report, I'm Dominic Chu.
As you no doubt know, the French presidential elections begin this week, and the global markets are all fixated on the vote because of one of the leading candidates, Marine Le Pen. She wants to abandon the euro and return France to its national currency. Michelle Caruso-Cabrera reports tonight from Paris.
100 miles north of Paris is Hénin-Beaumont. In its historic town center, storefronts are shuttered. And on the outskirts, even more evidence of a long economic downturn. It is part of France's Rust Belt.
Here in Hénin-Beaumont, the unemployment rate is 20. So it's very huge.
The median household income less than $18,000. For those reasons and more, this is National Front territory. The National Front is the party of presidential candidate Marine Le Pen. The people of Hénin-Beaumont voted solidly for Le Pen in the first round of the 2012 election, and they're expected to do so again, attracted to her platform of economic patriotism that calls for the protection of French industries and also the protection of French labor unions.
For many people, I think that Marine Le Pen will bring back employment, for example, and I think a lot of French people just want to have the feeling that they are the priority of politics, and that is not the case anymore.
Not everyone in town likes her, though. Green Party member Marine Tondelaire says Le Pen is merely selling celebrity and that she won't be able to deliver on her promises.
It's like make America great again. It's make Hénin-Beaumont great again.
Le Pen isn't the only candidate making a big push in towns like Hénin-Beaumont. In fact, one block from her local headquarters is that of communist candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon. In all, there are 4 contenders running neck and neck to become the next president of France, and each one focused heavily on security in the last week in the wake of a terrorism shooting on the iconic Champs-Élysées last night that left 1 police officer dead, and the arrest earlier this week in Marseille of 2 men who investigators believe intended an attack during the election. Pundits say the heightened terrorism fears helped Le Pen because of her strong anti-immigrant stance and her criticism of radical Islam.
The effect of the terrorist attack would be, of course, to inflame the right-wing vote, but in the same time, after an attack, you have this state of mind with more to get united sometimes, so we don't know yet.
Caroline Forest is a former writer for the Paris magazine Charlie Hebdo, which suffered a terrorist attack in 2015. Forest fears for her safety when she's in public.
I'm used to it. I'm avoiding since the 7th of January to be in position to be attacked from the street from someone who can recognize me. It's part of the journalist's life today.
In fact, that's how many French people feel now. In France, it is a 2-round election process. This coming Sunday, there are 11 candidates for president on the ballot. The top 2 vote-getters go on to a final round 2 weeks from now. It is widely believed Marine Le Pen will be one of those 2. For Nightly Business Report, Michelle Caruso-Cabrera, Paris.
Still ahead, healthcare's uncertain future.
Here in eastern Tennessee, residents are frustrated by the impasse and worried that next year they may have no Obamacare options at all.
Initial filings in Virginia and Kentucky show that health insurers there are still thinking about offering coverage next year. This comes despite uncertainty surrounding the future of Obamacare. 9 insurers filed to offer plans in Virginia. That is 1 fewer than this year, and 2 filed in Kentucky. Virginia and Kentucky have some of the earliest filing deadlines in the country.
Meantime, President Trump said today that there is, quote, no rush to get health care legislation done next week. But some residents in Tennessee that get their insurance from the exchanges are growing nervous because they're not sure what will happen to their coverage next year. Bertha Coombs reports from Knoxville.
A bicycle accident left John Nels in a wheelchair a few years ago. It happened about a mile from his home in Knoxville.
The force telescoped through my back and burst 3 vertebrae.
Now he's facing another healthcare challenge. He and his wife are self-employed and rely on their Obamacare exchange plan.
The biggest concern we have is what's going to happen going into 2018. We do have coverage for this year on the Humana plan, but in 2018 there will be 0 options in this county.
Humana is the only exchange insurer in most of eastern Tennessee, but it's dropping out of the Obamacare market next year. The state's insurance commissioner says with the uncertainty in Washington over the repeal of Obamacare and over funding for cost-sharing subsidies which help out low-income enrollees, other carriers won't step in.
The most critical issue for us is funding of the cost-sharing reduction payments.
Julie Mix-McPeak says if Congress and the Trump administration cut off funding for cost-sharing subsidies, the problem will spread.
We have 5 states that only have one insurer statewide, and then another 9 like Tennessee that have the majority of counties only having one insurer offering coverage. And I think the lack of funding for the CSR payments would be a blow to those markets.
Area clinics like Cherokee Health Systems are seeing increased demand for preventive screening appointments from patients worried that they'll lose coverage at year's end.
The lack of clarity, the changing every single day, in a way makes it harder because one minute you are ready to deal with one plan, and then literally 2 hours later, or even the next day, there could be a different proposal on the table.
Here in Knoxville, frustration with the political infighting is high because the threat of no Obamacare plan is real, and many here feel Washington doesn't get it.
Do they realize what type of pressure that you face every day in making healthcare decisions?
Simply waiting to let the current law explode is going to leave a lot of people hurt.
And the longer the debate goes on, the higher the number of people who could feel the pain. Bertha Coombs, Nightly Business Report, Knoxville, Tennessee.
Weakness overseas hurts results at Schlumberger, and that is where we begin tonight's market focus. Despite seeing strength in its U.S. market, the oilfield services company said that there was a drop in activity and sales in China and in Russia, causing overall revenue to miss its mark. The company's lower profit was in line with estimates, though. Shares were lower by 2% today to close at $74.84. And Kansas City Southern said that its profit grew as the railroad operator benefited from an increase in carload volumes. The results beat expectations. The company also reported a rise in revenue, but it did see shares initially fall on concerns about how President Trump's renegotiation of NAFTA will affect Kansas City Southern's Mexico operations. Shares were off nearly 3% when all was said and done, closed at $87.99.
United Continental's CEO Oscar Munoz will not add chairman to his executive title next year. In a public filing, the company said Munoz requested his contract be revised to remove any provisions granting him authority to become chairman. United said it would determine at a later date who would fill that role. The shares were off a fraction to $69.56. And shares of Skechers fell today as investors focused on the company's weak guidance out after the bell last night. The footwear maker posted better than expected sales and profit thanks to strength in its international and retail businesses. But Skechers also said it sees earnings for the current quarter below forecasts. Skechers shares down 2.5% to $25.48.
Well, Americans are buying up homes at a quick pace. Sales of existing homes rose to their highest level in a decade. The National Association of Realtors says that sales climbed nearly 4.5% in March. Tight inventory is still the biggest factor. Supply is lower than it was a year ago, prompting homes to stay on the market now for just about 34 days on average.
And it's time now for our market monitor, who has some names of stocks that he says will benefit from demand in the housing industry and any tax rate changes out of Washington. This is his first time on the program, so let's welcome Michael Sansotera. He's the Chief Investment Officer and Senior Portfolio Manager of the Ridgeworth Sylvant Large Cap Growth Fund, which is up about 9% this year. Welcome. Nice to have you here.
Nice to be here.
You're talking about growth, but you say growth is a condition, not a category. So you want to look for companies that exceed those expectations.
That's right. Growth can happen anywhere, including in cyclical businesses like housing is a great example. The trick is really understanding what's already priced into the market, how long can those conditions persist, and will you be able to profit from it in a longer-term perspective?
Let's get to the stocks that you like this week. D.R. Horton, the biggest home builder in the country. Is that the only one you like, or why do you pick this one?
Sure. No, that's our favorite one. That's the one we own from a home builder perspective. We like their ability to execute, first and foremost, in 27 states at the low and medium range of the market. We also like their ability to purchase land and raise price. What we've seen through D.R. Horton through the years is really the ability to find places where homes are really needed, price accordingly, manage accordingly, and take market share. They're one of the fastest growing home builders in the country. And that's because of execution, and that's part of the reason why scale has been real important for them.
Also, the remodeling trend, kitchens and baths. You've picked a company, Fortune Brands Home and Security, that really has quite a big footprint in that particular area.
They do. Kitchen cabinets, faucets, as well as doors, windows, and security. This is a company we've owned for some time. We've seen their kitchen cabinets business get consolidated. It's been a very fragmented market. They're doing the same thing now with plumbing, buying some smaller competitors. They're going to take their plumbing revenue from $1.5 billion to probably closer to $2.5 billion in the next 4 years. And we think as they do that, they'll do it more profitably than many investors suspect, and at the same time will take market share from a lot of the other smaller fragmented players in the space.
And sort of in the same category there, you have A.O. Smith in the boiler and water tank area, right?
Correct. Decidedly not as sexy a business. It's more of a GDP plus a little growth business for water heaters and boilers, both on the residential and commercial side. But what we like about A.O. Smith is really their China exposure. They've got about 30% of the business in China. It's been growing north of 20% for 10 years. I think for the next 10 years, it'll probably be growing in that mid-teens range. And really what we've seen is their ability to sell ancillary products to the Chinese, not just water heaters, but water purification and air purification. These are things that the Chinese market wants pretty bad. And they've got this kicker that should the Trump administration manage to get some tax reform done, they could bring a lot of cash back to the United States from China.
On that note, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Michael Sansotera with Sylvant Capital Management.
My pleasure. Take care.
Coming up, the man who accurately predicted things in the past now looks to the future.
I'm Jane Wells in Los Angeles, where we have the worst traffic in the nation. Where should America spend its infrastructure dollars? Coming up, we talk to a futurist who predicted what Los Angeles would look like in the movie Blade Runner. He also predicted wearables, handheld devices, and driverless cars decades before they happened.
Volkswagen will pay a nearly $3 billion criminal penalty for cheating on diesel emissions tests. A federal judge approved a deal that was negotiated between the automaker and the Justice Department. That fine pushes the cost of the scandal past $15 billion. Volkswagen recently pleaded guilty to conspiracy and obstruction of justice.
And Wells Fargo has now agreed to expand its fake account settlement. The bank saying that it will now include customer accounts all the way back to 2002. That increases the bank's total payout to more than $140 million. The larger settlement was agreed to after an internal report showed that the bank officials knew about the creation of unauthorized debit card accounts earlier than thought.
And finally tonight, what does the future look like? Sometimes we'd all like to be able to take a little peek at what's ahead. But there's one man who has a pretty good track record at predicting the future, and Jane Wells spoke to him.
Check this out. It's a painting predicting the Kentucky Derby in the year 2075. There's a man with a wireless handheld device, messengers on wheels like a Segway, and the floating board over the infield is called the Internet. This image was created in 1976 before any of this existed.
Wait, it says Internet. In 1976, you wrote Internet.
Yeah, he did. Sid Mead has been accurately predicting the future for decades.
My mantra is that if it's a good idea, it's going to happen eventually. These are from Blade Runner.
Meade is a visual futurist, a legend in Detroit for his car designs, but he came to Hollywood 35 years ago to create the cars and the look for Blade Runner. Over the years, Meade has predicted things like driverless cars and wearables all came true.
Los Angeles hasn't turned out quite as awful as Blade Runner predicted, but it still has the worst traffic in the nation. So where does Sid Meade think America needs to put its infrastructure dollars? Not in building more lanes.
This is looking west on 1st Street.
In fact, Meade sees a future with fewer people owning cars, as millennials don't see the need.
And they're just not interested in it. They have social media to talk to their friends, I mean, worldwide. So you're going to have more people using the same car, and that, of course, diminishes how many cars you make.
Meade says freeways will be used for driverless Ubers or trucks delivering goods from Amazon. What about the Hyperloop?
It's a good idea in terms of its own convenience, but the infrastructure cost, I don't know who's going to pay for that.
And Sid Meade thinks that in the future, more of us will live in cities. So infrastructure spending should bring nature into urban areas. Things like the High Line in New York.
You create a country neighborhood in the middle of the metropolis. And I know that's going to happen more and more because it's such a good idea. You have to think of all this stuff.
He's been right before. For Nightly Business Report, Jane Wells, Los Angeles.
He could be right again.
I just want to know, he's got that picture of the Kentucky Derby. I want him to think who's going to win the Kentucky Derby. Then we got something.
Then we got something. That does it for Nightly Business Report tonight. I'm Sue Herrera. Thanks for joining us.
I'm Bill Griffith. Have a great weekend, everybody. See you Monday.